We're going to dance today. This is performance art this afternoon. All right. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Terry Lopez, and I'm the Chair of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Northern New Mexico College. Yay, that's us. I'm honored that Dr. Robert Bashara, the organizer of the event and a faculty member in my department, gave me the opportunity to share words of introduction for Dr. Patricia Trujillo. In Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, every day something treasured disappears from the fictional island. Emeralds, ribbons, perfume, and even birds. The author describes the community as shaken, disoriented, and lacking a sense of identity. And it is those few that have memory of what has passed that are seen as forms of resistance against this tyranny. Now, you're probably asking at 3 in the afternoon, why did I start with this? Because historic and contemporary systems of oppression seek to negate memory and who we are. But Dr. Patricia Trujillo refuses to forget. And speaking of her powerful sense of remembering, for me is an appropriate introduction for her. So, Dr. Patricia Trujillo remembers. She remembers how her parents were both school teachers and how her father would use baseball stats to creatively inspire students' learning. This memory fuels a fierce commitment to an education that is similarly inspiring and empowering. In one class of hers that I had the honor of attending, she had students interrogate established understandings of quote-unquote a liberal education. She had students reach down into their own experiences, and as Sir Ken Robinson notes, as a necessity in any education, she awakened students to what is inside themselves. Dr. Patricia Trujillo also remembers her community. While working on an oral history project here in northern New Mexico, she had mentioned how she mentioned to the participants how she loved apples. Sometime later, when walking to her car after work, baskets upon baskets of apples awaited her, surrounding her car. Her participants remembered that she loved apples, and they also probably remembered the respect that she afforded them in that oral history project. Finally, she remembers her home, her history, her querencia. Trujillo has not turned her back on her native Española. Rather, she lends her blazing intellect, her ternura, her pasión to the Española Valley and its people. She extends that passion to all manitos, Chicanx, Latinx, y toda la gente, to all, because she remembers that this is a place of sanctuary. Really, to get to the heart of the matter, the metaphor of a bridge, for me, best symbolizes Dr. Patricia Trujillo's remembering. In her work titled Feminisms, Trujillo herself evokes the image of a bridge and calls her readers to, quote, think of the function of the bridge as a connecting force, often between two previously unconnected territories, unquote. Trujillo's memories of learning, community, and of history not only help to connect a multitude of identities, but fuel her movement to overcome and carry over boundaries of racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, to create new landscapes and paradigms of social justice. She does this best with her words. In The Memory Police that I referenced at the beginning of this introduction, the author, Ogawa, describes the sole library on this dystopian and lonely island as, quote, a shabby single-floor wooden building where the books seem to cower in the shelves, fearful of crumbling to dust at the slightest touch, unquote. By contrast, Trujillo vibrantly describes her writing process with, quote, piles of books on my desk, with Post-it notes blooming like gardens of thought on rows of highlighted texts. Xerox copies of articles surround me like friends cheering me on, unquote. The contrast cannot be more stark. Trujillo's work does not cower. It does not shrink away, but rather it unflinchingly takes us to new, quote, previously unconnected territories, unquote. To conclude, Chicana feminist, activist, poet Gloria Anzaldúa writes in this bridge called My Back, writings of radical women of color, quote, Caminante, no hay puente, se hace puente al andar. Voyager, there are no bridges, one builds bridges as one walks. Her writings, her work, and Dr. Patricia Trujillo's remembering has us join her as she creates a vivid architecture of both memory and possibility with her words. Please welcome Dr. Patricia Trujillo.
I want to thank my new colleague, Tara, for that beautiful introduction. I'm about ready to burst into tears, but I will spare you all. At least for now. Maybe later in the talk I will be crying, but thank you so much. Sengimu, buenos días le de Dios. Me llamo Patricia Trujillo y soy la hija de Elaine Trujillo del Huache y también del defunto David Trujillo de Upper Ranchitos de Taos. In northern New Mexico, it's very common when you meet somebody, it's where are you from and who are your people? And so I just shared with you all that I am the daughter of David Trujillo of Upper Ranchitos de Taos. He's passed away 8 years ago this October. And my mother, Elaine Trujillo of El Huache. And El Huache is a small village, probably just about 5 miles north of here. And it's a Genisaro village. Genisaro villages in northern New Mexico and throughout the entire state were outposts that were created by the Spanish Empire, and they were essentially peopled by detribalized native people. So a lot of us who identify as Hispano, Chicano, I identify as Chicana, Chicanx, in northern New Mexico have this heritage of being the descendants of these detribalized peoples, in addition to our relations from Mexico and from Spain historically. And so what that means is that I come from a mestiza heritage. And today I speak to you from what Chicana theorist Mary Pratt Brady calls a radical mestiza praxis. Before I start, I'd also like to share my gratitude with Dr. Robert Bashara for convening us all together and his kind invitation today to speak. And also to our students and to colleagues from all over the world, I understand, who made this conference a success. And I'm also taking the privilege of how Dr. Bashara has modeled for us being able to strike out words and to question them for my Indigenous land acknowledgement. So here I'm striking out the word acknowledgement and saying that perhaps we should make an Indigenous land pledge, or more accurately, we should acknowledge colonialism. Northern New Mexico has had several waves of colonization, starting first with the Spanish Empire in the late 1500s, then again by the United States in the 1840s. And if we think again, like our colleagues in the last panel asked us to, as identity or spaces in process, and I'm also going to talk about this. I also want to point to my colleague, Dr. Mariah Gomez's work about how there is another wave of nuclear colonization in northern New Mexico. And so to say all of that in acknowledgement of colonialism is to also say that you are on Tewa land, and this campus is on the traditional homelands of the Capo Owinge and Oke Owinge Pueblos. And for me, acknowledgement is not enough. So really, when we think about what is acknowledgement, it's a moment of reprieve for the privileged to benefit from settler colonialism. And as a mixed race person, I identify myself as part of that. And to honor the praxis orientation of this conference, I suggest that in addition to an acknowledgement, that we also make a pledge to support the continued work of Indigenous peoples in northern New Mexico. So for instance, I have a picture of my dear friend, Beata Sosi Peña, who works with environmental justice with Tewa Women United. And we would ask that you get involved with Tewa Women United's campaign to change the environmental health regulation standard, which is currently called Reference Man. Reference Man is a 5'8", 152-pound Euro-American male, and it's what's used to base the environmental standards for what is called legacy waste from the national labs that most impact our Pueblo communities. And so Tewa Women United has been working on a campaign for years on the federal, state, and local level to get Reference Man changed to Indigenous pregnant farming women. Because when we think about those who are most vulnerable, Indigenous pregnant farming women more accurately represents where the standards should be set. Because when we protect the most vulnerable, we protect everybody, right? And so that's one thing you can do. You can go to Tewa Women United's website and see how you can get involved. And then I know we've been talking a lot about being anti-colonialist, but there's a reality that we live in. So I would also ask that people support the work of Indigenous peoples working right now on Tewa land by making a donation. And so I'll leave this slide up for a little while and highlight the works of 4 organizations that are doing radical work in our communities. First and foremost, I've already mentioned Tewa Women United. Tewa Women United works at the intersections of reproductive justice, environmental justice, and Indigenous women's thoughts. Honor Our Pueblo Existence is another organization that is working, again, to decolonize, but a lot of these organizations, and I'm going to quote Dr. Christine Castro here, who is an Indigenous woman scholar, and she is from, I want to get this right, Hemis Taos and LA Chicana. She is making a call for us to really think about our language, right? So whereas decolonization has become an important tool for us in higher ed, she is also asking us to think about how we, instead of decolonize, how we re-indigenize, right? And instead of working against patriarchy, how do we work to rematriate? And so also thinking about how we layer onto meaning when we think in those ways. So Three Sisters Collective is actually led by Dr. Christine Castro. And then last but not least, we have the Traditional Native American Farmers Association, TNAFA, who really work across northern New Mexico to make sure that our traditional seeds remain in production, but also that the practices are being passed on in lived experiences with the next generations. So I kind of mean this facetiously, but I mean it actually in terms of a praxis orientation is actually financially support these organizations and find out more about them because they're doing really amazing work. Excuse me. So just a really quick map of my presentation. I come from a literature background, so I will have my preface of my positionality statement, and then I'm going to be giving this presentation in 3 chapters, and really trusting you as the audience to weave and connect some of the big ideas that we've been thinking about through this conference. So the first is more of a personal essay. It's short. It's called The Moon Rises Over and Over Again in Hernandez, New Mexico. Then I'm going to read part of a larger argument I'm making about literary gentrification in northern New Mexico, and so how rhetoric becomes a tool that we can either have used against us or that we can re-indigenize to do different work. And then the last is actually a co-authored piece with students from a class I taught called Education is Offering. And if time permits, I've also brought some examples of what I'm calling tarea in my work. And tarea in Spanish means homework, but I am coming at it from a perspective of taking homework out of classrooms and what does it mean to do the work of home with our community to rematriate and to re-indigenize our communities. So my positionality is I was born and raised in the Espanola Valley by 2 teachers. I love that they were invoked in the introduction. We grow up working in what is called middling class. So that place between the interstitial space between being working class and middle class. My parents were both school teachers and quote unquote earned a middle class income, but in fact the reality of our life still kept us very much in touch with a lot of our traditional cultures in northern New Mexico that rely very greatly on access to the commons. So here you'll see me throwing leña with people here still gather their own firewood. You go to the forest to do different things. So people still really depend on hunting and fishing a lot, gathering and foraging different traditional foods like piñón and capulín at different times of the year. And so I really grew up, like I say, in this bridge space between the old culture that my family were raised, my mom and dad were raised in, and my grandparents, and being in that more quote-unquote modern arena of having parents who are working in schools. I have a very unique positionality in that I am the third generation of college-educated Chicanas in my family, and where it's just super, like it's as empowering as it is to lift up and to celebrate first-generation students and to hear the perspectives and stories. I also find myself as a woman of color in a very unique position of being the third generation. And so my students and I have really great conversations about that, about how my grandmother was really intrepid in the late 1940s. She was widowed after the World War and was left with 5 children to raise, as well as her extended family. And at that time, she was also being really influenced. She was actually one of the housemaidens who worked for the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. And so the fact that she was working outside of the house, she had different kinds of influences who saw in her and were telling her, like, hey, you should go to college, you're really smart. She already had a teaching certificate from the Spanish American Normal School, which is now Northern New Mexico College. I'm going to veer off track here for a second, but understanding that the Spanish American Normal School in 1909 was opened to create essentially a teacher ed college with the outcome of essentially teaching, having teachers teach Americanization, right? A big part of the project of the Spanish American Normal School was to teach assimilation. And so my grandmother was also one of these women who was always juggling a traditional identity with a modern one, and did so very seamlessly. But so what that meant for my family is that I'm the third generation, my niece is the fourth, and that we talk about it in really in critical ways, right? What it meant for her as a widowed mother. She also walked on a crutch, so as somebody who was differently abled to go and fight for a place for herself at a university meant really that she was the person who started this tradition in our family and carved that path out for us. And also, to her credit, modeled for us what community-based participatory action research looks like in her everyday work. She went on to have a career of 47 years at Hernandez Elementary School, and we'll see a picture of Hernandez here in a second, where she understood fundamentally that children cannot go to school if they don't have their basic needs met. So every year she would buy shoes, buy jackets, buy school supplies, and that was just always the modeling of my house and how we work and serve community. I identify as a Chicana feminist theorist, and in the words of my mentors, Dr. Sonia Saldivar Hall, that means we put our literature to work. And this all connects to the ideas that positionality matters in community work, that we need to be honest. So even though I am very much a community member in Española, what does it also mean to always be really transparent and open with the different privileges that I bring now that I have an alphabet soup after my name, and also using that position of power to share power. So how do we take what is available to us in higher ed and to bring that to the community to make it available? So this means that it's not just about relationship, it's about right relationship. So making sure that we're checking our privilege, checking our relationship, checking our contributions as we do the work. And we should never make any assumptions about the nuances of community. Community shifts and changes. A lot of times people will make assumptions about what it means to work with Northern New Mexicans, and then you have the kid with green hair listening to punk rock music come in the door, and a lot of those assumptions are blown out of the water. For me, a lot of what the work that I do is absolutely connected to community health, and community health is always, from the perspective that I work through, connected through stories. And it is stories that shape the community. And so I just used this picture. That's my 10-year dossier that I still get teased about because of the size of it. And then that was blue corn that we actually grew on our Sostenga farm here on campus. And so one day I was working on my dossier to turn it in, and somebody was like, "We need to buy blue corn." And so there I was, like weighing and measuring blue corn. And it was just a really funny picture. And I just love also that it has the bag that says "Grown with Tradition." So the first piece that I'm going to read today is my chapter 1, and this is called "Moonrises over Hernandez Again and Again." And I'm going to leave this photograph up while I read this because I speak about it a lot in this piece. So, one of the most famous and sought-after photographs in American fine art photography is called Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, shot by Ansel Adams in 1941. I first encountered this photograph as capital A, art, in my university art history course. I was taught to appreciate this photo from an objective perspective, to memorize all manners of facts about its medium. It is a silver gelatin print that stands the testament of time for many reasons, but particularly in terms of technique. The photograph remains one of American photography's most studied images because of how Ansel Adams reprinted and captured the image over the years, adjusting the clouds in the sky and burning and dodging its development. It was not until the 1970s, over 30 years later, when he had printed the sky as an almost cloudless, dark-toned expanse, that he felt he had achieved an effect equal to his original visualization of the scene. I remember throwing up my hand in class and proudly proclaiming, "Hey, a lot of my family's buried there." The reply, "Interesting, Mr. Hill, but not pertinent to this conversation." Where I really grew to appreciate the cemetery as art was from the yearly cleanings that first my Gramita Marina, my great-grandmother, then my Grandma Lola, and then my mom would drag me, my siblings, and my primos to each year on Memorial Day. The famous moonrise happens to be located over the Campo Santo in the village where my mother's family is from. By the time this photo was taken in 1941, generations of my family were already becoming the dust that became the land that bore the people who bore me. This is the San Jose de Rio Chama, Campo Santo. People are no longer buried there, but there are families like my own who go out each year to do the annual limpia, the cleaning for the ancestors. You'll notice that I used the word drag earlier, as in kicking and screaming, in regards to how my grandma and my grandma got us to go clean each May. It was a ritual that we prepared for weeks in advance when late April brought the displays of plastic flowers to bloom in the aisles of TG&Y and J.W. Owens, and those were general mercantile stores here in town. This is where Gramita could easily spend her entire chequecito, the small monthly Social Security check she received, buying artificial gardens for all the relatives she could remember. Each year, I would observe her making mental maps to catalog everyone who needed remembering. As she taught us, people only die when no one tells their story any longer. First, she would close her eyes and trace the mental image of the Campo Santo speaking the names of her loved ones. Antonio Francisco Montoya, Maria Bernadita Martinez, Jose Antonio Martinez, Fred Valdez, Conrad Valdez, Baby Freddie, Tony Valdez, and on and on. When she got stuck, she would start telling stories of growing up and which tío lived next to which tía, and who they married and where they'd come from. As she did her remembering, she told us stories of marriages, unrequited loves, and tragic deaths caused by lightning strikes with keys in the pocket, being bucked by a horse, or just plain old heart attacks. She told us the stories of women dying in childbirth, leaving entire broods behind, or of the small graves for babies who never made it to life, marked with a simple circle of rocks or a wooden cross. Once her stories were done, she completed the mental tally for flowers, and either my grandma or my mom were sent to the store to complete the purchases. After the flowers were bought, hoes and shovels and rakes were collected for all the family members. As the youngest cousin, you'll hear this a lot in my stories, I was given the job to pick the weeds that were left behind with my bare hands, AKA the detail work. We'd pack coolers with the makings for bologna sandwiches, Lay's potato chips, a box of Little Debbie snack cakes and Cokes, Always present was the red plastic jug with the retractable spigot filled with water and ice for the entire family to share. Once the car was packed with all the tools and necessities, we'd head off for a day with the ancestors. I say that I grew to appreciate the limpios of the Camposanto as art because it took me well into adulthood to understand the value of this practice and others like it. At the time, I can fairly say that we kids were reluctant. Anyone who has spent an entire day doing hard labor under the hot New Mexico sun, sweating salty drops and seeing Fruit Loop-colored sunspots, understands hard work is grueling, even if it is for your ancestors. But the elders taught us to work the cemetery by generation and by shade availability. These days were literally spent climbing and cleaning our family tree, right down to the earth where our ancestors were laid. After the weeding, we'd go through each grave, sweep the concrete or the dirt, and we'd move the rocks that encircled many of the graves, rinse them in a bucket of water, a bucket of warm soapy water that Grandma had bought, and replace them just they had been the year before and the year before that. It might seem futile to wash rocks, but it always struck me as an endearing gesture, one more chance to wipe the smooth face of a rock in lieu of a loved one's. Every grave marking, whether official military headstone or a beaten wooden cross, was checked for maintenance. If we'd forgotten a hammer, Mom used a rock to pound nails back into the wood, or we would be sent around to find usable wire to reassemble the accessories of the afterlife. Our labor and the stories we heard weaved intricate mandalas around our ancestors through grave markers and weeds and figured us seamlessly into the design. The catalog of the Akron Art Museum describes Adam's photo as a timeless metaphor of the stillness of the American landscape and the magical character of its light, end quote. For me, and as I connect to the photograph by virtue of my culture and identity, there is nothing still about it. Though beautiful, the photograph only hints at the art of the scene, of the howling laughter at the stories about how my grandpa Fred came back from World War II to start a hamburger stand in El Huache, only to find reluctant customers in a community of people who had never eaten a hamburger before. Of the lamentations for loved ones lost before their time, like my Tio Tone and his friend who were struck on their bicycles by a drunk driver in front of their house. They were only 10. Or the stories of all the beautiful and clever women who kept our houses together. A vivid memory from my childhood is wandering and running through the orchard of family trees while the adults held vigil and prayed. To only see this photo as a landscape removes the character of its people and the culture of story. As Leslie Marmon Silkle writes of her community, quote, "The people perceive themselves in the world as a part of ancient continuous story composed of innumerable bundles of other stories," end quote. Culture is made up of these stories. They tell our history, they speak our languages, they shape our everyday lives, not only into objects of art, but into art itself. The everyday rituals of our communities form the lenses through which we will see the world, and that brings breath to art. I wrote this a couple of years ago, so it was on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the photo. I still want that professor, who I'm sure has long forgotten me, to understand that those layers of family stories are pertinent. I see a moonrise over Hernandez every night, and I also greet the sun each morning from this place. Some of these mornings, I head over to Socorro's restaurant for the I Lost My Ass at the Casino breakfast special, and wave at the San Jose de Rio Chama cemetery along the way. My favorite table is underneath the poster of Mr. Ansel's photograph. Here I sit amongst the voices of the many regulars. In their speech, I hear the cadence of my relatives, the stories of where I am from, and our pertinence is affirmed again and again. Chapter 1. So I share this personal essay about the way that our parents, lead us into these kinds of traditions that become our life, not just part of our life, but become our life, to talk about the way that Northern New Mexico, and from the literary perspective, I am a literary scholar, is often rendered from the outside in. And so people can look at things like Moonrise over Hernandez, which is also one of the iconic photographs that is considered of modern New Mexico. If you were to go to Hernandez now, you would see a much different picture. In all of this space around the church, there are houses and trailers and different businesses that have popped up. And so there's this sense that those are the stories that we don't hear. And so in my work, and in regards how it feels to work, to live, to learn in our communities, there is this psychic connection to like the work of the psyche that happens when we aren't exposed to literature, to art that reflects who we are as a people. And so in many ways, in my pedagogy, in my classroom, that's something that's always a part of how I teach and help to render experiences for students. And also in my scholarly work, it's how I look at and theorize the spaces and the rhetoric around me. So chapter 2 of my talk is going to be a piece from a longer piece that I'm writing about literary gentrification of space in northern New Mexico. And I just want to frame it by showing you some photos that I've taken around town. Not just here, this particular photo was taken in Albuquerque. And you can see that it is a realtor. She's sitting on some steps. What you might not be able to see, because it's not the highest quality picture, is that it's an adobe house. And it literally reads, "Live in history, I sell it." Here's another for another housing development. And so just we heard about in the last on the last panel about the gaze. So here you literally have somebody framing the gaze of the Sandia Mountains, or Ocupin, one of the 4 traditional mountains of the Tewa people. And it says, "Can you picture it?" And instead of it being a sacred site or sacred mountains, it's my balcony, right? And then last but not least, this is also from Albuquerque for the Anasazi downtown lofts. And I'm sure these are lovely places to live, but in terms of how they're framed through a lens of literary gentrification, here we see, or I don't know if you can see it very well, but this is urban antiquity, right? So it's putting those two things that are very at odds with each other. And it says, "Imagine living here." So this is an advertisement for people to want to live here. And I reframe that as saying, imagine living here, right? If you're from indigenous and traditional communities and see your culture commodified in this way constantly. So the next piece I'll read is going to talk about that. So, with a particular focus on the space and literature of north central New Mexico, I argue that the imagined northern New Mexico produced in literary and social space replicates the material reality of how space has historically been consumed in New Mexico. So we've heard from many others who have spoken here about Soja, Harvey, and Massey, but for students in the audience, if you have questions, but those are all spatial theorists who talk about how to create meaning and think about how space creates meaning. So Soja, Harvey, and Massey declare that space is ontological. I add that it is through rhetoric that space, and therefore the ontology of space, is made knowable through language. Just as use of space comes to represent ideology, the rhetoric that makes it knowable is also imbricated in the ideological projects of crafting imagined space. Evidencing how contemporary consumption is the concomitant of how space and rhetoric have been employed and constructed in New Mexico, consumption becomes a significant lens by which to understand the relationship I am describing between space and rhetoric. In particular, I am interested in the concept of gentrification in northern New Mexico as a spatial and rhetorical position by which to consider the displacement and the disenfranchisement of ethnic New Mexicans, not only in the literal space, but also the imagined space of New Mexico. In Myths and Meanings in Gentrification by Caroline Mills, she asserts that gentrifiers write onto and read from scripts of landscapes, asserting, quote, "Each society's moral order is reflected in its particular spatial order and in the language and imaginary by which that spatial order is represented," end quote. So we see that here with these new housing developments, with the refurbished lofts. A lot of the lofts in Albuquerque are in the traditionally Mexican-American parts of town. And so what happens is they get refreshed, renewed through gentrification, but then that language of the community is used to then market them as something to purchase, so almost as a way to purchase part of that identity. So thus, the renderings of actual space and imagined space in the gentrifying order always seems to have an interest in commodifying the mythic content of space, what Mills terms imagineering for the dominant society. To consider the representation of spatial order, literary gentrification, to consider the representation of spatial order, literary gentrification is the concept I employ to create a lens for understanding the ways in which space and rhetoric interact, that is, the ways that they co-create each other. Gentrification literally means to take a space perceived to be run down and old to renovate it for middle-class urban consumption. Gentrification studies emerged from the 1960s in England, where the term emerged to mark middle-class reclamation of formerly forsaken urban regions. As a discourse, the term gentrification exists in many permutations. Gentrification is usually configured materially through three broad theoretical paradigms in cultural geography, and this is according to Mills. Quote, production side explanations may take a managerial turn, pointing to the influence of a government and financial institutions at a local or international scale. A structural Marxist interpretation defines a more general production side theory of gentrification that focuses on the switching of investment back into inner cities and the recommodification of derelict environments. In turn, the third model of explanation critiques the emphasis on production of gentrifiable locations. Instead, with reference to the sphere of reproduction, this production of gentrifiers approach interprets urban change in terms of the restructuring of class and gender relations consequent upon changes in the organization of work and in the domestic sphere. Gentrification studies, for the most part, have remained an academic discussion in the cultural geography, economics, and in consumption studies. Often these discussions center on the causes of gentrification, what the outcomes are for the newly migrated, more affluent consumers of space, and the displaced local working class moved out of the space. In regards to space, most of the academic work done on gentrification also remains in the realm of the urban, rarely engaging in the rural, let alone a concept of the radical rural. So when the rural is engaged, it is usually through the distracted lens of urbanity, so how the rural compares to the urban, but it never sees the rural as an organizing concept in and of itself. So my study emerges from a lacuna in gentrification studies that overlooks the spatial potential for rural ontologies as the sites for rural epistemic practice, so including the realms of community-based rhetorics. Gentrification historically is a social science-based study how one group of more empowered people displaces another group of less empowered people. It does not consider the larger context of how space has been occupied and developed through colonial and/or imperial regimes of power via rhetoric. Gentrification studies tend to render place through individual property ownership, and it is this individual ownership that allows for community membership in place. So that is to say, when we're using this concept of individual property ownership as that which gives you a place in community, it ignores the fact that there were other kinds of organizing forces that exist there. So tribes, villages of people who have existed in northern New Mexico on the part of indigenous people for times immemorial, and then in the part of Hispano people, even as settler colonial people, as people who have been here for over 400 years. And so when I talk about northern New Mexico, I specifically use the term indigenous to refer to the Pueblo peoples of northern New Mexico. And when I use the term traditional, it includes indigenous and the traditional villages that have these long historical communities in northern New Mexico. So let's see. Gentrification does not consider the larger context of how space has been occupied. I read that. Sorry, I lost my place here. So gentrification is also rendered as an urban dilemma, although many people outside of the city understand displacement from property. What I suggest in connecting the spatial to the rhetorical through studying gentrification as this rhetorical practice is that rhetoric becomes one of the technologies for displacement of groups of people from any space, real or imaginary. Working to embody gentrification, I assert that the study must focus on identity and agency as much as it is focused on physical space. Mills asserts that in everyday language, ways of living, strategies for coping, oftentimes that these things are objectified as lifestyle, and through language, places are given meaning. To extend Mill's observation, my project is invested not only in the basic understanding of how gentrification exploits traditional myths and meanings of space, and culture, but also how once gentrification occurs, the revised myth becomes central to new privileged meaning of space. Gentrification is not only understood by how New Mexican space is changing physically, so the material experience of displacement. It is also understood through concepts of ideological space in literature and the construction of social space. I am defining literary gentrification as a process invested in the restructuring of literary spaces for use by hegemonic institutions for the means of educating, representing identities of, and entertaining a reader about a space for middle-class consumers. For example, Jim Sagal was a well-known and respected regional writer in northern New Mexico. In his lifetime, he collected and rendered dozens of stories and poems that represent his understandings of the Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx communities of northern New Mexico, most notably in Española, New Mexico. I argue that Jim Sagal's work can be read through a lens of literary gentrification. Despite his work to represent the space of Española through his narrative, his writing can be problematized by analyzing his rhetorical perspectives in regards to the space knowledges that are translated through his texts. Sagal took local knowledges and rendered them through hegemonic lenses, often while critiquing the local communities through a deficit model of loss and longing of traditional Nuevo Mexicano culture. So I don't get into it here, but I have another article where I write specifically about Jim Sagal. And when he was interviewed once, he referred to himself as the Rio Grande Valley Columbus, that he had come here and found all of this, local culture and flavor, and that it was for him to make it known to the world. And so there was this real sense of how he became, how local folks then came to know him. And so in my own life, I write about how one time when I was eating at a local restaurant, Angelina's, when I was a child, I couldn't have understood this, but we were eating, and Jim Sagal was sitting at a table, and he was sketching, he was writing. And so I was with my uncle, who was made very uncomfortable because he kept staring at us and taking notes. And so there was this sense of my uncle feeling like he was being researched. So he took his plate of food and went outside and ate it. And so I never understood what was happening as a child, but then as an adult, reflecting back on experiences in our own community, understanding now that this was such a violation. It was a crossing of boundaries to just literally sit and observe people in their quote-unquote natural environment. So Jim Sagal failed to address how his use and maintenance of dominant rhetorical traditions to render New Mexico, whether that be implicitly or explicitly, facilitated much of the displacement and loss he critiqued. As well, his writings were constructed in large part for consumption by middle-class educated audiences at universities. My reading of Sagal addresses another kind of rhetorical logic, a logic that moves beyond what is being said to how it is being said. It takes the structure of writing as a meta-discursive space that we can read. The spatial rhetorical logic that I employ does not suggest that Sagal and other writers, myself included, should not engage in dominant rhetorical traditions like I am right now, but merely that we should not privilege these traditions with invisibility. In this sense, we can also begin to think, teach, and write about spaces of rhetoric. And so in terms of the time we have, I'm going to pause there, I think. No, I'm not, okay, because I want, in terms of the politics of citation, I want to make sure to cite the Chicanas. So also something that we need to think about is how gentrification imposes and assumes a class aspiration. In thinking about literary gentrification, it begs the question, who is the gentry of literary gentrification? Should we be concerned with who is consuming literature and how literature is being made available? My border thinking about rhetoric insists that we consider how the space and place of our writing has meaning. Just as Walter Mignolo, quote, attempts to remap the Americas in the modern/colonial world system rather than reproduce it in the national imaginary, my work with literature and social space in New Mexico attempts to write Nuevo Mexicanos and native New Mexicans onto the literary maps of the state. From this decolonial position, I work to create a New Mexican literary terrain that not only seeks mere textual inclusion, it seeks spatial, structural inclusion as well. In other words, quoting Mignolo, transcending the colonial difference can only be done from a perspective of subalternity, from decolonization, and therefore from new epistemological terrain where border thinking works. Border thinking can only be such from a subaltern perspective, never from a territorial, for example, from inside modernity one. Border thinking from a territorial perspective becomes a machine of appropriation of the colonial differences and differences, the colonial difference as an object of study rather than as an epistemic potential. Border thinking from the perspective of subalternity is a machine for intellectual decolonization. To engage urban middle-class investments of spatial rhetoric, or to challenge, right, these urban middle-class investments of spatial rhetoric, I employ Gloria Anzaldua's theories on rhetoric, Emma Perez's concept of the decolonial imaginary, and Chela Sandoval's concept of the differential consciousness model to articulate the ever-changing space that New Mexicans negotiate. This engagement delineates the central issues to consider how relative mobility and power over mobility and communication entrenches the spatial imprisonment of other groups. Pointing to the contradictions of New Mexico space, my project considers how dominant spatial rhetorical paradigms provide access to mobility and power in New Mexico. And so it's also how we think about this mythologizing of New Mexico renders invisible or erases the lived material circumstances of New Mexicans. So when I talk about like some of these very significant contradictions, the one that I'll use today is thinking about where we're at right now in Rio Arriba County and our neighboring county of Los Alamos County. Rio Arriba, in terms of resources and, I should say financial resources, is always rendered as one of the poorest counties in the state. And in contradiction to that, Los Alamos is always rendered as, it is one of the wealthiest 5 counties in the country. And usually it bounces between second, third, and fourth place each year when that's noted. And so how this has to do with the gentrification of the literary and thinking about this rhetorically is that in New Mexico, when you live and work here, the story that you hear about the national labs is that it's a great employer, right? That is where critical cutting edge science is going on, and that it is a community of intellectuals and scientists. And what you hear about Española Valley, in contradiction to that, is a very different kind of story. It's usually maligned and framed in the negative. Española is usually framed in the deficit as having high incidences of substance abuse and crime. But what is never told in that story, how we have taken how we need to do as a spatialized rhetorical reading of this space also includes that we should look at the history that brought the national labs, that literally took sacred land from the pueblos by eminent domain and reconstructed the communities around it. So one of the things that I've been working on with community members is to literally look at the map of Española, look at the place names, look at the street names, and tell the stories of them. So even if you were to look at this campus and the 3 major intersections that cut through us is right here, as on the main entrance, is Paseo de Oñate, which represents, of course, Spanish colonialism and the entry of the colonizers into northern New Mexico. If you were to exit from the backside of our campus, it's Railroad Avenue, which represents the imposition of United States consumption of northern New Mexican land. And then at the end of our property, if you walk, our college property ends. There is a whole piece of Indian land, of property owned by Santa Clara Pueblo, and then you can get to the river. But I also say that that river marks like the third avenue for thinking about how consumption, which is the indigenous consumption, related to how communities have always organized themselves around the Rio Grande because of having access to the resource of water. And so there are just a lot of ways that we can think about this. Also, all throughout Espanola, a lot of the street names, like there's Loudermilk Drive by Walmart, which is becoming a newer district of commerce. Loudermilk Drive is the name of the family who got the contract to actually plow and build the road between Espanola and Los Alamos, what people call the Camino de la Culebra, right, the road of the snake. And so there's this sense of the way that all of these layering of histories and stories literally shape the city that we live in today. So this is not to say that space was not consumed materially or rhetorically prior to white dominance in New Mexico. Rather, it is to say that all consumption was not invested in a capitalist model per se. Recall Massey's assertion above that understanding consumption only in terms of capitalism is insufficient, that we must understand access to space as, quote, about power in relation to the flows and the movement, end quote. In conversation with Mill's concept of gentrification as recast myth, Massey's point becomes even more significant. From a production side perspective, Mills offers that gentrification is a rational response to the opening of a rent gap, move over, production differentiation, for instance, new aesthetics. So I'll read that again. So Mills offers that gentrification is a rational response to the opening of a rent gap. Moreover, production differentiation is a rational response to changing market conditions. But the notion of rationality is not acultural, as Salins points out. Production is always a cultural intention, and rational production for gain is in one and the same motion, the production of the symbols. Indeed, not only does economic activity produce symbols, it is made possible by symbols. The accumulation of exchange value is always the creation of use value. This is where a New Mexican spatial rhetorical analysis poignantly asserts the power of persuasion and perspective, and where differentiated access becomes evident. In the oldest communities in New Mexico, there is a long tradition already of how to be that is reconfigured for capitalist gain. Pragmatism is often romanticized or I cannot say this word, my own word, aesthetized, made into art in service of a hegemonic vision of New Mexico. Features of the land and culture become means for fixing social production. An example from my own experience in my parents' relationship is one that we can see all over right now because it's in season. It's chili ristras. So chilies have become a symbol of Santa Fe style. The long bundles of red chilies are often portrayed as hanging from the front of a New Mexican adobe house for decoration. For years, there's been an internal struggle in my parents' home. There is this sense that my mom would buy ristras for decorative purposes, and every time that she did, my dad would often consume them as food. And so ristra's primary purpose are as in terms of like how to be and how they were traditionally used, their primary purpose are as a method for drying chili after the harvest. For my father, who grew up in this tradition, he saw their decorative purpose as incidental and not instrumental, and for him, ristras were useful storage units. Because of my dad's perspective on usage and the meaning of consumption of ristras, my mom's decorations are always lopsided or thin. Interestingly, my mom also grew up in the tradition of growing, drying, and eating ristra chili. However, she also identifies with the social structure of Santa Fe style that would make the ristras a status symbol and decoration. On one occasion, in effort to keep one of her ristras for decoration, my mom bought one that had been shellacked. So sure enough, my dad broke off a few of the chilies one day and tossed them into a pot of pozole, only to ruin the whole pot of soup. So on the issues of ristras in my parents' home, working class pragmatism is in constant conflict with middle class objectification. So these days, only edible ristras are allowed in the household. And this example speaks to how cultural intention is significant in the production of spatial and rhetorical symbols. So overall, this project is concerned with contemporary renderings of literary and social spaces in northern New Mexico and the rhetoric that is used to make the spaces known. Keeping Massey's differentiated axis in mind, along with Ansaldua's dissolution of binaries, I put theories of cultural geography, consumption, and rhetoric into conversation with how mobility and power over access to dominant rhetoric entrench spatial imprisonment. My research aims to provide a previously under-researched understanding of New Mexican rhetorical history. It articulates the need for a decolonial rhetorical intervention in New Mexico studies. It complicates the way that we look at our home communities, which are already always complicit with hegemony for rhetorical alternatives. But as Massey posits, can't we rethink our sense of place? Is it not possible for a sense of place to be progressive, not self-enclosing and defensive, but outward-looking? Towards this effort, I engage my theoretical research project into Praxis, into the practice of my classrooms, and inform educational research for pedagogy reform. Ultimately, this project, with its attention to New Mexico, is not about silencing hegemonic rhetoric, but it is about complicating the conversation for a richer, more accurate perspective of New Mexico literary history. And so then now, I'll check the time, we'll move into this one last piece. And it hopefully will read faster, but I also purposefully want to end with the words of students. So this is a piece that I co-authored with my students Joy Dilly, Eric Garcia, Evelyn Gonzalez, Michelle Martinez, Cody Miles, Shayna Porter, Nicole Soderberg, and Tatiana Smith. And also this piece was dedicated to the late Emily Awapovi Martinez from Okeowinge Pueblo. So just to give me a break, but also these are going to be some pictures that you're going to hear a reference to in this piece. In our community, Tewa Women United has been working for this point for over 5 years to create the Healing Foods Oasis. And in many ways, this is the brainchild and dream and desire of Beata Sosi Peña, who dreamed that we could create a space on city land to plant a garden that would only have edible, medicinal, and companion plants. And that when the garden comes into maturity, that it would be available for anybody in our community who needs the medicine or food from it. And so it happened. She is building this beautiful terrace garden in the traditions of Pueblo people on one of, it's literally on the backside of City Hall. And so anybody who has any kind of business to do is also going to be in interaction with the Healing Foods Oasis. Also, the Sayain Circle, the Grandmother Circle of Tewa Women United, have created spaces for contemplation and meditation. So there are also seats where you can go and sit. And it is also in relationship, it borders the Fred Valdez Park. I'm sorry, that Fred Valdez is my grandfather, the Valdez Park, who I'm giving to my grandfather right now. So it's also a place where you can be and have access to healing, but it's also related to play, where you take your children and can be present with them at the same time. So this is a piece that was first published in a local newspaper called the Greenfire Times, and the Greenfire Times is news and views for the sustainable Southwest. So many of us in the north are taught since a young age to give a ceremonial offering each morning. My Pueblo sisters offer cornmeal and prayers. I was taught to acknowledge the sun in prayer for a new day. I whisper Ave Marias to myself in the car on my way to work, but I know that my gramita did it through song. We pray to the directions, to our ancestors, to our respective creator. An offering is an acknowledgement that we are part of a bigger world, and the humble action of gratitude pays respect to our relationships that allow us to do good for Mother Earth and her creatures. Our offerings are the introduction to the stories of our day. But often, in our modern world, even amidst our practices of offerings, we are jolted into our daily positions at work. In my world, it's in the classroom as students and teachers. We attend meetings, strike tasks off of our to-do lists, and are constantly moving to the next thing. We grab something to eat in our cars as we move from one appointment to the next, often fueled on caffeine and sugar. Our intentionality can quickly shift. Even if we start the day from a place of process and connection, we can slide into being product and outcome-oriented. As a college professor, I see this all the time in the profession and in the actions of students and faculty. We are all going at 100 miles an hour, and we forget to connect. It's ironic, you know? College classrooms are supposed to be the place where students prepare for the real world, but often there can be very little connection between the theory and practice of knowledges shared in classrooms to the work happening in the greater community. I decided to be mindful of this in designing a course for fall 2016, Writing the Land, Storytelling, Environment, and Indigenous Knowledge at Northern New Mexico College. In this cross-listed course between English and Pueblo Indian Studies, students were introduced to writings by Indigenous authors from the Americas and asked to consider how storytelling is a decolonial methodology for addressing historical and ongoing struggles for sovereignty and self-determination in their homelands, and how to coexist with settler societies. As Leslie Mormon Silko writes, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. They are all we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have stories." In this course, we moved away from single-authored papers as major assignments for gaining knowledge. Students did get to reflect individually in short response papers, but our major assignments were different. Our major assignments engaged in Indigenous methodologies of decentering authors from authority and centering community voice for power sharing. As the Pueblo adage says, it takes 1,000 voices to tell a single story. For midterms, students in the course were asked to plan, schedule, and provide a community storytelling event for our campus. The students designed an event called Food Stories, where we invited our campus community to share in a collective understanding of storytelling. Students organized a potluck and invited 4 storytellers to be a part of the event. The event started with 2 original songs, Red or Green, and My Grandmother's Kitchen, performed by Michelle Javier, who's in our audience. Hi, I see you out there. One speaker, Richard Cedillo from Okeowinge, shared stories of growing up with his grandfather, who still used a horse-drawn wagon for farming. The second speaker, Beata Sosipena of Kapowinge, shared stories of corn. And lastly, Daniel Chao from Cameroon, Africa, told the group of his food traditions. Over 50 students, faculty, and staff gathered for the successful event. Students from English 399 prepared foods near and dear to their hearts and began the event by telling some of their own food stories. In the reflections after the event, students and participants in the event shared a sense of gratitude. Cody Miles, a student from class, reflected, quote, "I'm proud of what we did. We made this place, the college, feel like really homey. When we are connected to a place, when it feels homey, we have a sense of belonging. So how do we create more educational spaces that encourage connection, service, and sense of belonging?" As we veered into our final project, I knew that we had to put our storytelling to work in the community. Knowing that the organization, Tewa Women United, was hard at work in installing the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis, I asked if we could use the opportunity to create a bridge between Northern New Mexico College and this community project. Tiwu was very receptive, and Beata Sosipena, program coordinator for the environmental health and social justice at Tewa Women United, responded wholeheartedly. She and I co-designed a 6-week-long project that allowed us the opportunity to go out to the garden, bring an Indigenous environmentalist activist into our classroom to share in discussion, and actively demonstrated to students the power of such relationships. It established ways to put our literature to work. all these dialogues about the power of story began to be demonstrated in our expanded classroom. All of a sudden, stories were alive and supporting not only our learning, but TWU and the 100 of plants in the Healing Garden. The final project that we all decided on as a group was to create a story-based gift for the community. Alongside the project, we read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. Kimmerer asks, what else can you offer the earth, which has everything? What else can you give but something of yourself? A homemade ceremony, a ceremony that makes home. In our case, we knew there is the physical labor of the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis that community members have volunteered to prepare, plant, and care for the garden. We viewed this firsthand on a visit where we held class in the dirt. But how could we make an offering of our stories? In conversation, Beata mentioned that over 200 varieties of edible, medicinal, or companion plants were included in the garden. She wanted to make sure that the visitors to the garden were able to identify and to get to know the plants, their usages, and their names in Tewa, Spanish, English, and scientific. I asked, what if my students were to perform research and write the plant stories? We agreed that this would be an important gift and that it would help build relationships between students and the garden. I set to work and developed an assignment where students had to research and write the stories of 5 plants they selected. We got the list from the landscape architect. Some students were reluctant to jump in. I heard things like, I'm not a planter, I don't know which one to choose, to manzanilla, I want that one, I use it all the time. After choosing 5, they had to provide the plant name in all the languages mentioned above and write the story of the plant however they chose. It could be formal academic writing, or they could choose to write it from the plant's perspective in the first person. However they chose to write the plant stories, their responsibility was to provide information to the community and to honor the plants. Students really got into this project. They hit the library, Google, and even had to perform interviews with native speakers of Tewa and New Mexico Spanish. Not everyone had access to interview resources, so guess what? They had to share and support each other in the work. Students got savvy and began to share stories and books with one another. This was not the classic final exam paper where students are forced to write in isolation for the audience of one single professor. No, they were talking to each other, to other professors, and members of their community. Each had to present their work to each other, and finally, as a group, present it as a gift to the Healing Foods Oasis. Beata, who was along with us for the entirety of the project, helped us reframe the end of our semester from a final exam to a final ceremony. Collectively, we decided that our offering would be a ceremony to reconnect with our plant relatives. The students collated a binder with their stories, organized for easy usage by the greater community. On our last day of class in December, we went out once again to the garden. This time our purpose was to present gifts to the plants and to leave our offerings in the ground. Each student wrote their intentions on a sheet of paper, which we buried and blessed with tobacco and sage. We presented our stories and prayed that they will be used to heal our community. And in the end, we became part of the story of the Healing Foods Oasis. There were some tears and lots of laughter, but we all imagined ourselves connected to the well-being of our plants, our beautiful healing oasis, and the people who tend and visit there. And isn't that what stories are supposed to do? All of a sudden, all these people from various geographies belong to a new shared place, a new home. The next time you're in town, and hopefully you all before you leave town, you can pop by and visit the Healing Foods Oasis, spend some time and read the plant stories. Maybe you find yourself connecting with the plants as well. Until then, be inspired with these reflections by the students in the course. And so here are the students in the course. And in terms of time, I will read 3 of them, but if you're interested in the rest, I can make them available. Cody Miles says, after doing all this research to find out what these plants can do, it really changed my perspective on plants. This made me realize that nature really can provide for us and that not every sickness requires a doctor. Before this project, if I would have seen these plants, I would have thought that they were just weeds and useless. Now I realize that they are much more than that. I hope that whoever gets to read our stories about these plants realizes too that they can do much more than what we think. Eric Garcia says, Eric was In northern New Mexico, we say, bendito entre las mujeres. He was the only man in the class. Through our class and the books we've been reading, I can say I found a deeper appreciation for Mother Earth. I've learned to improve my ways. For example, now I can go riding or walking without headphones. I feel the music is a distraction to the natural world. By us appreciating the land more, the thought process is to get us to understand the importance of how it plays in our lives. Once we've discovered and gained knowledge, we hope it changes the viewpoint and humankind will help save the world. And I'll end with the words of Nicole Soderberg. She says, plants are our healers in so many ways. They help us in healing our bodies, to healing our spirit, heart, and mind. They live in the same world and as we do and share some of the same issues humans have. We are more alike than we think. We must respect the value of taking care of our elders. They have known this earth for many years and have lived through issues we might not have encountered yet. So we must listen when they speak and help them when they struggle to walk and grow. We must protect them when danger is near and make sure that they get to live a full cycle of life. The more I learn about plants, the more connected I feel to them. I understand them more and the interconnectedness of Mother Earth and all her beings. As we are out and about in our busy lives, plants wait patiently for us to come and visit and share a conversation with them, to take time to get to know each other and the world around us, in which all nature is included. Thank you.
All right, that was fantastic. And now we have, ¿cuántos minutos?
15.
17. Thank you. If I can use yours. About 17 minutes for questions and answers. I'm going to be very pushy, and I'm going to ask the first question, and maybe that will spark the chispa for more questions for Dr. Trujillo. So first of all, again, a fantastic talk, and there are many points that I'd like to bring up, but I'll only bring up one, so there's space for others. I was really interested in the idea of gentrification, rhetorical gentrification, in particular the landscape, the northern New Mexican landscape. And you'd mentioned that in that Camposanto in Hernandez now there are trailers and so forth. And what it made me think of is in Ranchitos, because my family's from Talpa, near Taos as well, most of my family members live in trailers. And oftentimes it's seen as a sign of a failure, which becomes racialized and assigned to Chicano identity from outsiders. And so I would, I guess there would be a question about, like, what do you think about that? Because trailers are really great places to live in the sense that they're cheap and that you can still live on your land. The roofs aren't that great, but you know, most of my family still lives in these trailers. But then also maybe it could also be a symbol of, in many ways, what it's like to be a woman of color in academia, in the sense of there's an idealized picture of how we are supposed to be, who we are supposed to be, but then there's the reality. Because in many ways, the idealized or gentrified space is very passive, just like the idealization of a woman of color in academia, like tokenistic, passive. But then there's obviously a much more complex identity. So I don't know if what you would think in regards, that's what it made me think of in regards to that connection of idealization, gentrification versus like a very deep-rooted reality.
Yeah. My brain is going like,
Yeah.
So I would say that I was born into a household and lived and grew up in a single wide trailer that was actually attached by what we call cuartitos around here, right? Like, because in the old adobe houses is that it would usually start as 1 or 2 rooms, and then as a family grew, like if they was another baby or somebody got added, they would just build the cuartito to add to it. So if you go to houses that are traditionally New Mexican and not in the gentrified like view of New Mexico, but in like the actual lived experience of New Mexico, houses can be kind of awkward and have weird shapes because because they've just been growing in these very organic ways. And so I believe that my trailer that I grew up in with my parents kind of had the best of the both worlds, because it had the cuartitos on it and it had the trailer space.
Yeah.
And so it's also that idea that we work with what we have, right? I think about, as I was preparing for this, I was rereading Michel Desserteau, The Practice of Everyday Life, right? And the concept of tactics and my brain's going blank, tactics and strategies. Yeah. And so that a lot of times, like the Hispano families that I grew up in, is that there were a lot of tactics going on. But so like how there are all these different layers of colonization, of consumption, of capitalism that have been superimposed on us, and then taking those and making them into something different. And so, but that is also always consisting in that place of hegemony, because a little known story that a lot of people even here on campus don't realize is I worked at Northern. Northern was always my goal in this whole educational path, is I knew I always wanted to come and serve my home institution in my hometown, and I got a lot of pushback about that also from these gentrifying forces that have been made invisible. So if you're a student in northern New Mexico who shows promise, even since when you were little, you're often told that you have to get out of here, you have to leave here if you're gonna do anything with your life. And so for me, I very much came from that perspective, but I just always had a deep love for this place, for my family, for the culture, and so I always wanted to find that path back. And so I remember I was a young scholar. I had just gotten my master's degree. I had been hired as the director of the Writing Center here. And it was also like, I was young. I was probably like 22 or 23 in this position. And I was in a bigger meeting. And a lot of people don't even work here anymore. It's been that long of a time. But I overheard a conversation between two colleagues, both of them what we would identify as amenity immigrants, people who move here. It's a term that Sylvia Rodriguez uses to talk about people who move to New Mexico who love like the culture and the spirituality of it. And so they were talking about, one of the women was talking about her new house in Medinales and how she loved it. But the only thing that she hated was her view, because she had the view of trailers. And then the other person said, well, yeah, sometimes you just want to go out there and take a flamethrower, right? And so in my head, so it's like you literally want to take a flamethrower to the people who are from here so that you can enjoy your view. So it goes back to those images that like I always think about when I see them, that billboard, you know, of being able to own the view in that manner, and how there's just that constant tension between manitos, people who are ethnically from northern New Mexico, just being able to live. Yeah.
Thank you. There's some other questions from the audience?
I'd love you to expand on the writing, how it's been gentrified with maybe John Nichols as well as Sagal.
So I don't specifically look at Nichols in my studies, but I probably could say a lot about that. So some of the other, a quick example I could think of is a critique of Willa Cather. So Willa Cather comes in the early 1900s, is living with other literary modernists of the time. So Mary Austin, Charles Loomis, there is very much a sense that there's like a literati in Santa Fe, and it's very exclusive of people from New Mexico. And so a chapter that I write about is about a man, his name is Amado Chavez. Amado Chavez is actually somebody, his dad kind of saw what was coming on the wind in terms of colonization. So he kept one of his sons at home and taught him the traditional way of having a sheep farm. They were borregueros. And then he sent his other son, Amado Chavez, to Washington, D.C. to get a law degree. And so then when Amado gets back, he's a very complicated character, because he really starts to identify as being an American citizen in really problematic ways, and so does a lot of land grabs, and is one of the people who starts the Santa Fe Ring, which is still a big part of Santa Fe politics. But the way that I read Amado Chavez is as this cultural informant. So when you look at a lot of the, especially nonfiction texts of that time, if you look into like the footnotes, and I'm thinking specifically of Ralph Emerson Twitchell's History of New Mexico, it's considered the first like fully raw history of New Mexico. If you look in the footnotes, it's H. Chavez, H. Chavez, H. Chavez, H. Chavez. And I found a lot of different kinds of letters in archives where Amado Chavez is always disagreeing with how these writers are representing New Mexico, and he's challenging them that they got certain details wrong, and if they're going to write, they better, be sure that they're accurate. But to my finding, and I'm kind of obsessed with Amado Chavez, I've never been able to find an essay that he authored or any work that he authored as the sole author, right? He's just in the footnotes. And so in terms of like the spatial rhetorical work that I want to do is my chapter is called Rescuing Amado Chavez from the Footnotes of History. And it also begs that question of who else could be rescued from those footnotes of history as people come into our communities, like literally mine not just the land, but also the people of our resources, and then use them to create cultural productions of their own.
You mentioned how Los Alamos, the national lab, was acquired from the native people. Could you expand on that just at least briefly? And I'd like to say, I find it ironic that after using terrorism to displace the native peoples, then we build a lab to design weapons to terrorize people overseas furthermore. So
as a teacher, my students are here, I always over-prepare, so thank you for this question. Just recently, 2 years ago, we had a different convening here that's called the Historias de Nuevo Mexico, and the conference theme for that particular gathering was Querencia Interrupted, the Native American and Hispano Experiences of the Manhattan Project. And so Historias is a conference series that myself and my colleague, Dr. Matthew Martinez, started in 2012. And it was really to equalize the importance or the weight that academic or scholarly voices are given in northern New Mexico. And when we say equalize, you'll see that this is an academic and community conference. So for all of our panels at those conferences is we really try to balance the voices. If there is a scholar on a panel, that means that there is a community member on the panel. And then also just really doing the work of being very inclusive of the community. So in terms of talking about how the impacts of the national labs, we spent 2.5 days. At this conference in particular, we privileged the voices of people who had worked there as employees. As you can imagine, a lot of those folks are already in their 80s and 90s. Let's see if I can find the photo. And so what we did is we actually honored them as story protectors in our community. And invited their families to be a part of a gathering. But really what this was about was giving essentially a platform for people to be able to share stories also in a healing way. So we incorporated different healing modalities into the conference. So whether it was just having like a room for reflection, a room to stretch and to be in your body, we also did smudging ceremonies and gave people different modalities to take home with them. Because what happened is that in sharing these stories, a lot of pain was brought up, right? One of the conference participants, I remember it was in this building, being in the lobby, and she came and she gave me a really tight abrazo, right? Like she gave me this big hug, and she was like, "Mijita, I've been waiting to say this for 40 years, and finally our community came together and was able to say it." So there was just the sense that in and of itself, the conference was very healing. But then in terms of interrupting, like a lot of these like space rhetoric divisions that I'm talking about, is that the follow-up work is that we now have placed community members on a lot of different work groups. Right now, the national parks is, for whatever reason, decided to build a 3-site national park dedicated to the nuclear legacy of the United States. And one of them is going to be in Los Alamos. And so up until the conference, there was little to no inclusion of any of the voices from Hispano or Native New Mexican communities. And from the conference, we've been able to intervene and put community members onto those panels. That's one example. There are other ways that now hosting these kinds of gatherings have created opportunities for community members to be experts of their own stories. So like now we've been getting after the conference, a lot of people wanting to write about it, wanting to contact folks and tell their stories. But we really have norms that we decided on as a community group about how we are willing to share our stories or not share them. And so that could be its own conference presentation, but I just wanted to bring in and show that, like how we work with the people in the community to actually get this work done and to make sure that there is this intervention of voices. So this is a cool one. We did a hack the gallery. Some of the only pictures that exist from this time, because cameras were not very common during the 1940s in northern New Mexico, are part of the Los Alamos Historical Society. But when you would look at how a lot of these pictures were captioned, the people of color were only referred to as Indian or Hispanic, and all of the white folks in the pictures were often named by name and position. So we did a hack the gallery, and so we printed big posters of these pictures, put them up, and we invited people to write on them. Like, do you know who this person is? What's their name? What did they do? So here we have Dr. Camila Bustamante, who used to work at Northern, and she got really excited because she's pointing at, it's a picture of her aunt, was one of the USO women from the valley that would be transported either to Los Alamos or to Santa Fe to entertain the scientists. And so were able to capture a lot of the names in these photos that had never been recognized historically. So that's just an example. I'll put it back to that. So I was just going to say that just also on this end screen, that this idea that it's a lot of times in the academy, and of course it's beautiful and it's powerful. I love to spend time in the archives myself, but we can kind of become preoccupied with collections. So that idea that it's not just about special collections, it's about special connections. So a lot of the work we do in community-based participatory research is really about, how do we interact with each other? How do we make space? The historias also came into being because when I started working here, there were these 3 elder gentlemen who found out that they thought I was a historian. I'm a literary scholar, but they were like, finally, somebody hired a New Mexico historian at Northern. And so we would have coffee every Friday morning, and then ultimately the idea of having a conference came from what they wanted to share, what they felt like had never been heard.
I think there's a question over there.
Student working on Will Cather and representations of indigeneity, and so I just sent her a link to your talk on Amado Chavez, and the breakdown of the Ansel Adams photograph, quite amazing. But I was also thinking about what you were talking about in terms of literary gentrification, and of course, you're totally right in terms of the discourse around gentrification being so exclusively almost focused on urban experiences. Even David Harvey's The Right to the City. Because of exclusions from urban areas, or even Neil Smith's The New Urban Frontier. He uses the rhetoric of talking about colonialism and frontier, but he doesn't quite. It's from the 90s, but he doesn't quite get to a truly decolonial sort of model. Mm-hmm. But there's also a Dene, the other Dene, the Northern Canada Dene, not the Dene in the Navajo scholar, Glenn Coulthard, author of Redskin White Masks, mm-hmm. who's been talking about urbs nullis. So terra nullis is the imperial model of empty land for settlement, but talking about gentrification of urban areas and the pushing out of indigenous people from those areas in city area, in urban areas as well. So just to say, it's more of a comment than a question, but I just appreciated the real sophistication of how you're weaving all these stories together from the high theory to the community-based work, and it was an honor to listen to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's what I tried to do. Yay. And right now there are it's a very, very contemporary work, and I can share this list with Robert that maybe he could pass on to the group, but there is a new collection out of the Boston Review that is called Left Elsewhere, and it's ideas and imaginings from the radical rural. And so it's really interesting to me too, though, that oftentimes in the U.S., when we still think about rural, we think about like the rural South, we think about Appalachia, and we don't tend to think of the Southwest as part of that. And so that's just to say that there's just a very, how do I say, like there's a pot of soup on the stove and it's boiling, and we can be a part of being, of defining that.
Are there any more questions? I'll just maybe end on one note that resonates with the last comment. You'd mentioned, I think it was your gramita, that said people only die when they don't tell their story anymore, más o menos, right? It seems like that's what you're doing, is helping to facilitate, not tell other people's stories, but facilitate those stories and keep them alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I wanted to say that I didn't get a chance to, so thank you for this, is that in terms of politics of citation, is that the academy really trains us, especially like humanities, social sciences, languages, to be like the individual authors. And it really replicates that idea of American exceptionalism, right? That there's this great individual who's so smart and so brilliant. And what does it mean to like just demystify that? So I really, in my life, in my scholarly life, to the detriment of my tenure dossier at bigger institutions, right, have privileged publishing in local, regional magazines and journals, and helping other people to do the same. Because for me, my story is just one story of all the people in my community. And so my job as a literary scholar shouldn't just be navel-gazing what I write about. It's also about how we create spaces and support others. And so I'm the creative writing editor for the Journal of Chicana Latina Studies. And so part of our politics of citation, and we always say hashtag Cita Marxista, that's our organization, is also creating spaces to support emerging writers, so either from the community or from in different stages of the academy. Especially in the academy, if we're trying to help young people, especially people who have been disenfranchised, like young women of color, young men of color, to publish, how do we make space specifically to help create places where we can workshop our writing together, where we can get the critical feedback that we need, that sometimes even to decode, in certain journals, there are literally like almost equations that you have to follow to get something published, but if you don't know that, how would you know, right? And so having senior scholars, having other people who have gone through the process really demystify that. And we say that we have a feminist editorial praxis actually, in our journal, which is if a paper is not there, we don't just give revise and resubmits. We actually have a real commitment to working with young scholars to work on, even if it takes several drafts, and it is very labor intensive, but that we will work with people till they get to their place where their paper is publishable. And so that's also that sense of being in right relationship with the people whose voices we want to hear, which is everybody, right? Thank you.
All right. We did it! Some energy there. That was a really powerful closure for the Congress. So I really want to thank everyone that participated in the 2019 International Critical Psychology Praxis Congress, which includes conference affiliates, like the presenters, the keynote speakers, the panel chairs, and introducers, the student organizers, and anyone else that worked behind the scenes. So that includes sound, lights, film crew, everybody, right? So please give them a round of applause. I want to particularly invite the student organizers to come on stage and be recognized. So want to thank again all of our sponsors for making this event possible, and most importantly, I want to thank the attendees, because without you, we'd be speaking to ourselves in an echo chamber, right? I hope you enjoyed the Congress, and that you'll remember some things that you've learned here between yesterday and today. If you forget everything, at least remember the first principle I talked about yesterday. What was it? Do you remember? It was mentioned in the second keynote speech just now. Yes. Also, the videos from the Congress will be available on criticalpsychology.org, so you can always revisit the presentations, share them. It'll be an available resource for free for everyone. Also wish that you've made some new connections, right? Perhaps new friends, right? I would like for there to be a second ICPPC. It doesn't have to be here. Can be here again, but it doesn't have to be. It definitely, definitely will not be an annual event, as far as I'm concerned. It takes a whole year to organize this, and I'm willing to pass on the torch, but I actually want to put one condition, that it has to be someone from the oppressed, just to make sure that we maintain the tradition. Anyways, so let's keep the conversation going. Remember that I'll be editing a book of conference proceedings, so make sure to send me your paper by next week if you can. Enjoy the rest of your stay in New Mexico. Adios. I'll see some of you tonight. If not, safe travels, okay? Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Maybe to group photo.